With Ed and Austin, the authors of the new Chicago Way. So real quick, just as an introduction for both of them, Ed Bachrach is the retired CEO of Bachrach Clothing and the founder and president of the Center for Pension Integrity in Chicago. He's been featured and published in the Wall Street Journal, Chicago Tribune, and the Chicago Sun-Times. And we also have with us today Austin Berg, an award-winning writer, and he is the director of content strategy at the Illinois Policy Institute. He contributes opinion columns to the Illinois News Network and wrote the documentary film Madigan, Power, Privilege, and Politics. Thanks for joining us today, Austin and Ed.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So we're excited to talk about Chicago. Big municipal elections this year. We're considering them the big races to watch for the first half of 2019. And I'm going to turn it over to Austin, who's going to give an overview about what this book is about, what they've been looking into with the city of Chicago, and what they've found over the past year.
Cool. Oh, I see a cat's tail back there. Awesome.
Sorry, that's Matterhorn.
I love it. So the book's about cats. No, just kidding. The book is really, we started out noticing, as many of the people watching probably have noticed, that Chicago's problems are conspicuous. We are an outlier on many measures, whether it's finances, whether it's policing, or the homicide rate is very, commonly cited statistic about Chicago, schooling, many different measures. And we think that often, if not always the case, the cause of these outsized problems have been hastily made decisions that have been allowed and encouraged by a mayor-centric governance structure in Chicago that has been left behind by every other major city except for ours. So we look across at the 15 most populous US cities and look at their government structure. We interviewed people from all of those cities. These are them, Chicago's peers. So this is sort of our sample size. And we ask them, how has their governance worked out for them? And we take back those insights that we gain from researching those other cities, and we try to apply them to Chicago and point out how much of an outlier we are in our governance structure. So this is really the marquee statistic that everybody sees in Chicago, our homicide rate. We see most states hovering far below the 20 per 100,000 mark. Chicago is far higher. But what solution do we always hear about this? You can go to the next slide. The solution is always more cops, more police officers. Well, we're already on per capita basis the highest of any major city in the nation. And I'll let Ed jump in also on this.
Yes. So we studied the governance structure of policing, and yet, as you'll see later on, we find that the provision of police services in Chicago is an inferior product at an inflated price.
We'll get into that. Los Angeles is really our case study. We looked at every city with policing, but Los Angeles, especially post Rodney King, has had two really key reforms that we can talk about later that's improved their policing governance. You can go to the next slide. Ed, do you want to take this one?
So the book covers every aspect of city governance: the mayor and council, elections, schools, policing, budgets, pensions, and other topics. But we're looking here at just the top 20 school districts in the United States. And the ones outlined in red in that previous slide are the ones where the school board is appointed by the mayor. This slide shows the averages of expenditure per student for appointed school boards and elected school boards. And you can see that it's about a $6,000 difference. So that's what we're seeing among all of these school boards. So the idea that there's chaos and as a result inflated expenditures for elected school boards is not substantiated by the facts.
Yep, next slide. And one more. Awesome. The actual borrowing is what results, because you can, one of our sort of mental models we talk about in the book is make it free. And many mayors over the years have sought to make things free through the issuance of debt. And we see the consequences of that in per capita pension debt. And we are so far past every other city on that measure.
So we also look at the several characteristics of the city council, and as a result, the strength of the city council vis-a-vis the mayor or versus the mayor. And one of those measures is the size of the council. And except for New York City, which has more than 3 times as many people as Chicago, no other city has 50 people on the city council. The average number of constituents for Chicago aldermen is 54,000, and the average number for the average of the top 15 cities, including Chicago, is 117,000. So this calls for fewer councilmen that have no aldermanic privilege or prerogative, and that are presided over by a council president, so that it can be a robust, independent city council and not a rubber stamp for the mayor.
So one of the ways that Chicago has become, if you look at the work of University of Illinois Chicago professor Dick Simpson, who was also a former alderman himself, he puts out a report, he's put out a report constantly over the years about the rubber stamp nature of the city council, that it's not a true check on mayoral power as you would expect the legislative branch to be in any modern city government. Instead, the mayor makes all the citywide decisions, and the aldermen are left to be the mini bosses of their own respective wards. And one of the ways that this is perpetuated is, if you look at the slide, we are one of only 2 major cities in the US to let the mayor directly appoint council members when there are vacancies. So when we started writing this book 2 or 3 years ago, the statistic was, with over the last 28 years, the mayor had appointed 28 aldermen in Chicago. So when you have that many people who owe their job to the executive, you can't expect them to be a check on the executive. Imagine if that's how Congress worked, if the president was just allowed to fill vacancies in Congress. We also see that most of the major cities place term limits on those council members, whereas Chicago does not. So you have people who are able to stay in office for 50 years in the case of Ed Burke, and totally dominate their ward with no check on that. So Chicago is one of only 4 cities not to place term limits on the council member, on council members. We are the only real major city to not have term limits on council members or the mayor. The cities that don't have council term limits here do have them for the mayor. Ed, you can take this one.
Yeah, another key practice of practically all major cities is that they have a voter-approved constitution, and they also have a mechanism to regularly revise that city constitution. It's called a city charter, and it's called, the process is charter creation or charter revision. But among the top 15 cities that we studied, only 2 do not allow for a charter, and Chicago is one of them. So having a charter and a charter process is the first step in instituting many of the reforms that we've talked about in the book.
So this is something that people intuitively maybe know in Chicago. I talked to a lot of people about this, and when you explain it to them, they're like, yeah, hey, why do we vote now? I don't know if you guys were outside yesterday, but it was not a good day to go vote. 2 weeks ago during the vortex, not a good day to go vote.
No, and even some polling places were closed during the vortex.
Right. Yes, and I think the Polar Vortex Day was the first day that the Loop super site polling place was open, and probably the emptiest day in decades in the Loop. So look at what happens when you put an election in February instead of November. The temperature is way lower on average, way more snowfall inches and days. And we looked at, I believe I can't see our table here, but yeah, over the last 16 years, the average voter turnout in these February municipal elections are less than half that of the November elections. If you go to the next slide, we will see that we are a total outlier among our peers in having elections in February. And what happens when the voter turnout is so low is that often this was an old machine tactic. It really served the interest of a political machine that I'm sure many of you have read about or heard about. It doesn't exist in the same capacity today, but precinct committeemen and captains would get out the vote for their motivated interests on that day, and average people did not want to go trudge through the snow to go vote, whether that be for a reform candidate or for someone else. So today you still have motivated special interests are overrepresented in voting because there is so much discouraging of democracy through the timing of our election.
As we showed earlier in the slides, and we described more fully in the book, Chicago is a fiscal mess. It has practically junk status for its bonds, and yet all of its general obligation borrowing is just mushrooming. So we looked at how cities typically control their fiscal policies. And we looked at 3 fiscal control measures. The first we looked at was whether or not there's an independently elected controller or chief financial officer. And there are 5 cities that out of the top 15 that do not have somebody like that independently elected, or the city manager, and what we're looking for is distance between the mayor and the management of the budget. Then we have another fiscal control measure, which it looks really at robust oversight by the city council. In other words, are the city council, that would be, yeah, there we go. That would be the a committee of the city council that has an independent staff and holds hearings, and they keep an eye on the city budget. They don't just accept what the mayor or the city manager hands to them. And finally, we looked at the voter participation in both borrowing and in tax increases. And lo and behold, if you look at the only city of the top 15 that has no's across the board, it's Chicago. Next slide. Yeah, so there you are. Next slide. We also did a comparison just to see where budget problems crop up. So we compared Chicago to Los Angeles. And as you know, Los Angeles is hardly a libertarian utopia. It's a heavily Democratic, heavily union town. It's more than twice the size of Chicago, and it has 45% more people. And yet the 2 biggest expenditure categories for both cities, which is police and fire departments, they spend about the same dollars. So if Chicago just had parity with Los Angeles in terms of population, it would be saving $650 million in these 2 departments.
So we also looked, the only entity that we looked at that wasn't directly City of Chicago was the Metropolitan Pier and Exposition Authority, which is the governing body of McCormick Place and Navy Pier. And we did that because of one reason, and that is the enormous debt that it holds. It's got almost $4 billion in debt, as you can see, under McCormick Place here. We have the most prime exhibit space of any convention center in the country. Attendance has been flat or down for decades, and yet year after year, you see the mayor tout amazing tourism numbers and do ribbon cuttings at McCormick Place, while more and more tax dollars continue to be diverted to a venture in an industry that has proven not to live up to expectations across the board in any city that you look at. So we have 2.6 million prime square feet of prime exhibit space, and that's more than exists in all of Mexico. For what? We have very little to show for it. The economic impact of McCormick is constantly overblown, and we continue to shovel money into that, especially from the mayor's office.
And finally, a question that everybody asks us is there the political will in Chicago to reform and adopt many of the suggestions that we have in the book? So we took a screenshot from a 1981 book by Harvard political scientist Sam Huntington. And the title is American Politics, The Promise of Disharmony. Sounds like we should all read that again today at the national as well as the state and local level. But he talks about the gap between our ideals for our government and our institutions in terms of what we perceive as the gap and how strongly we believe in it. And what we see in Chicago is people really don't understand the gap between our ideals and what we actually have in the city. And they don't believe that things could be any better. So they're either cynical or complacent. And yet our book is full of the nuts and bolts suggestions that tell people what to do and how to do it to improve government. We hope to move them from the lower right-hand quadrant to the upper left-hand quadrant. So that's a sampling of the dozens of insights and stories that we have in the New Chicago Way.
So if you're listening and you have any questions for Ed and Austin, please feel free to drop them in the chat. But we had a few submitted questions from Ballotpedia staff who read the book. And we're just going to kick off with a good overview question. What do you guys think is the most concrete and simple change that Chicago could make? What would affect the most change based on what you've proposed?
It might not be the simplest, but it's the most concrete. It's the simplest to understand, maybe we could say, and it would do more than anything else in the book. And that's what we mentioned in the slides is a city charter. When you hear the word charter in Chicago, people think charter school, and yet it is the way that every major city is governed in the U.S. and revises its governance structure. And Chicago doesn't have a real city charter. So we have been pushing hard for a voter-approved city charter that lays out responsibilities for the mayor, for the council, for new elected offices like an elected city attorney or an elected chief financial officer. That would be more than anything else that change could come from that. And the real reason for it is if you do any of these changes in a city ordinance, for instance, the mayor could instantiate a lot of this stuff today, but that's subject to the whim of the mayor, again, if he or she decides they don't like that structure. So that's why we push so hard for a city charter.
Ed, any other thoughts?
Ed, do you want to check in?
Well, I agree with Austin. I was seeing a question pop up there.
Yep, so I can go to that one now from Karen. Have you seen anything during your research or since you published that gives you hope for a positive change? Or have you seen other places turn themselves around across the country?
The second question is very easy. 120 years ago, at the turn from the 19th to the 20th century, every major city in the United States had a governance structure similar to ours, with a strongman mayor. But over the last 120 years, they've reformed their government. They've distributed power intelligently across the city government. So, and they've done it in response to crises, and many of them have had crises much worse than Chicago. So there is hope, it can be done. But you also have to attack these things early on. If you let it drag out too long, you're going to end up being like Detroit. We looked at the top 15 cities in the United States, and if we had done this 50 years ago, Detroit would have been one of them. Now it's a small town. It isn't big enough to overcome many of its problems.
Great, thank you. What effects, this is from Janice, what effects do public sector unions play within the city when they have so much power or control?
Well, just by sheer numbers, when you have elections with such low turnout and you only need a couple 100,000 votes, I believe Ed might be able to know the average off the top of his head, something like 250,000 votes to become mayor on average over the last 20 years, or almost 20 years. So when you have a candidate who is able to make, the mayor essentially is writing all those collective bargaining agreements with all the major unions, whether it's police or fire, laborers, or any of those unions. And when you have one choke point, there's a very high incentive for them to get someone who is amenable to their interests in the office. You wouldn't expect anything less. The problem is when you have, 100,000 city workers, and you only have, 30% turnout. Those groups can have inordinate sway on public policy. So,
I would echo that. Whereas 100 years ago, it was the various ethnic groups that were vying for political control, whether it was the Czechs or the Irish or the Italians or the WASPs in Chicago. Now the principal interests are public employee unions, real estate interests, and vendors and bankers. Those are the four principal interests that are lobbying City Hall. And among those, the unions have the greatest clout.
Great, thank you both. One question from somebody in staff who is working on the Chicago elections. Have you seen current Chicago institutions, major figures, or candidates for office express support for a charter? So mentioning that could be the biggest change Chicago can make, or have there been any previous credible pushes for one in the city historically?
Historically, I'm not aware of a big push ever for a city charter for Chicago. There's been one candidate who I probably won't name because the mention of a charter was so weak and it's not clear that they are actually advocating for a charter, but they said the word charter. One candidate has done that. Ed might be able to
step, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there have been two candidates that have talked about having some kind of a referendum to approve some of the reforms that they've talked about, whether they're going full bore on a charter or whether they're just talking about some half effort, we don't know. But that's what we see. Interestingly, Chicago or Illinois has a constitution that was created in 1970 in a constitutional convention. Prior to that, a city charter was allowed, and the city could have adopted a voter-approved charter. But now it's much harder. It would require going back to those constitutional provisions to provide for that in the city of Chicago.
Great, thank you. Another specific policy question. It looks like the Chicago Police Consent Decree was just approved. Can you comment on whether or not you think this is a step in the right direction and why?
The consent decree is definitely a major step in the right direction. If you read all 232 pages of that consent decree, you'll scratch your head and ask yourself, weren't they doing all that stuff already? So it is a testament to how mismanaged the Chicago Police Department has been. But there are two things you need to keep in mind. There are three things about policing in Chicago. Number one, the consent decree is for 5 years, but that doesn't mean that it just goes away in 5 years. At the end of 5 years, you have to go before the same judge that monitors it to see whether you passed the exam. And if you didn't pass it, then you're stuck with that consent decree. The initial consent decree in Los Angeles was 5 years. It took them 13 years to finally complete all the conditions of their consent decree. Second thing, people have been very critical of the role of the collective bargaining agreement between the Fraternal Order of Police and the city of Chicago. And yet, there's a clear provision in the consent decree. Nothing in this consent decree shall overrule provisions of the collective bargaining agreement. So the consent decree is still subordinate to the collective bargaining agreement. And finally, organizationally, the police chief serves at the whim of the mayor. And we advocate for civilian oversight along the lines of what they have in Los Angeles. And there have been many community groups in Chicago that are pushing for a police commission similar to Los Angeles, so that you have more professional oversight and civilian oversight of policing, and not just at the whim of the mayor.
Yeah, the two major, sorry, go ahead, Ed.
No, I'm finished. Mm-hmm.
The two major provisions that we point out that have done, I mean, Ed especially spoke with a lot of policing experts and folks in Los Angeles involved in that, improving that city's policing reputation and professionalism post Rodney King. The first one that always gets mentioned is the creation of a true civilian lay expert commission that oversees policing with very little direct involvement from the mayor. The commission hires the police superintendent. It's not the mayor's handpicked choice, for instance. The second big thing was the removal of all disciplinary procedures from the collective bargaining agreement and put into state law. So there's a peace officer's Bill of Rights in California, and that governs how you investigate police shootings. It covers all disciplinary procedures across the board, statewide, and those are not things that are bargained over, with a politician and a union president. Those two things have done wonders for Los Angeles.
Got it. Another staff submitted question. You suggest moving from nonpartisan to partisan elections that are scheduled alongside other elections. Why would this be more likely to increase more diverse partisan breakdown in these positions? Wouldn't the action more likely just move to the Democratic primary rather than the general election and cut most conservative voters out of a nonpartisan election?
Well, it's a very complicated topic, but what happens right now is we have, it's hard for us to keep track. We have between 12 and 14 people running for mayor. So you can take a shot at it right now and try to get in the runoff without being the definitive Democratic candidate. So it's having two effects. Number one, by having nonpartisan elections in a heavily Democratic city, it virtually outlaws any other party. Republicans consistently get between 17 and 21% of the vote for a Republican candidate on the top of the ticket, whether it be a president or whether it be the governor or other statewide officials. And yet there are no Republicans on the ballot for city elections. But also, when you have a regular primary, people realize that this is the final election. So whoever gets the most votes as a Democrat is going to be the Democratic candidate in what we hope would be a November municipal election. But right now, you could have the top runner in the what is now called the consolidated primary in February, and then you go to a runoff and they lose. So it is a very unstable system. And right now with this consolidated primary and as many people as are running, the top two contenders could get 11 and 10% of the votes, and then they would be in the runoff.
Austin, anything to add?
No, I mean, the Herald, the point I think people don't realize is, yeah, the Harold Washington, the case study of Harold Washington is the reason why this is set up this way. So that you cannot have, you know, in the case of Harold Washington, it was a very motivated, engaged Black voting bloc that got him past the Democratic primary against two, you know, very established, if you want to use that term, candidates. And this is this way so that would be very unlikely to happen again.
And kind of related to that question, do you view this set of reforms as a partisan issue, and why? Why not?
Well, why we usually don't even say the word bipartisan or nonpartisan when describing the solutions here, because, you know, the political makeup of all these cities, of course, leans Democrat. But you know, Houston is more Republican than LA, for instance. So when all of these prescriptions that we make in the book are drawn from other cities, usually dominated by Democrats, but not always. And they're structural in nature and have very little to do with partisan interests. So yeah, I would say it sort of cuts across the board.
What would be the best way to bring about some of these changes? So could community organizers from inside Chicago make a big difference here, or would it require more of an outside help? Can the federal government, do they have any jurisdiction with some of these, or the Illinois legislature, or even the county?
So that's a terrific question. And in direct line accountability, the United States is a federal system. So we have states' rights, and the 10th Amendment says that whatever the state doesn't do, the individual can do. But that being said, whenever Chicago gets in trouble, the dotted line descends from the feds. It wasn't the locals that busted Ed Burke. It was the feds. It wasn't the locals that looked at policing in Chicago. It was the Department of Justice. And we've had many other consent decrees here for decades. So it's kind of an awkward dance. The feds don't have any direct oversight with us, but they keep an eye on Chicago, and it's really the source of any reform that we have. That being said, they're not going to step in and superimpose the charter on us. They're not going to allow the city to go bankrupt. They're going to just stand by and try to protect people's rights. So what could happen? Ideally, you would get a community movement for better government, and they could do something about this. Short of that, in a crisis, there will certainly be a lot of recommendations. In either case, those reformers, whether it's in the wake of a crisis or proactively, they need to know what to do and how to do it. Otherwise, if they did make a big fuss out of it, they'd lurch, and they'd probably have one or two minor reforms. They'd get them enacted in state law or city ordinance, and they'd be done. And it would be incomplete reform. So that's why our book exists. It is an operating manual for how to change.
In terms of what people can do just directly, I'd say one, buy the book, and then two, read it and pick out stuff you like. There's going to be some reforms in here that people disagree with, and hopefully a lot that they do. And ask, if you're in Chicago, ask your alderman, have you read this? What do you think about this? What are some of these? Do you support any of these changes? Do you support one of them? Do you support all of them? Ask your state representative, what do you think? Why doesn't Chicago have a governing document? Why don't other cities in Illinois have this foundational tool for governance that every other major city has in the country? in terms of what people individually can do, I would say that.
So speaking of that, have you seen, just from both of your personal experiences over the last number of years, have you seen an increased awareness of these issues, or is it still just kind of as is, or are we just, have the residents taken up this mantle, or are we just kind of stalled out?
I usually talk about two examples. One is later last year, Chance the Rapper made the best explanation of aldermanic privilege that I've ever seen any media do. And the fact that Berg was arraigned, has brought up an entirely new discussion about why we let aldermen be these little mini bosses of their wards that approve sidewalk cafes and awnings and valet parking and all zoning and all business permitting. That discussion is coming up. We've seen one of the few issues where people do really look up and look at other big cities is on the issue of an elected school board. We're one of the biggest cities to have a school board directly appointed by the mayor, and that's rare. So I think on certain issues, there is awareness, but there is not really a comprehensive awareness of how much of an outlier we are. So that's why the book exists.
And I'll just echo that with different words. We've all heard the story about 6 blind men describing an elephant. And that's what we have here in Chicago. Everybody's got their little pet reform that they think is important, but nobody's looking at the comprehensive big picture and how everything fits together.
Great, that's very helpful. Unless there are any further questions from the listeners, this was great. I feel like being from the East Coast, this was a great overview for me on Chicago, and it was a great read. So I encourage you. I think your book's available on Amazon and through the SIU Press, correct? And then if you guys Austin, I know you have a Twitter, if you want to give a shout out to your Twitter and anywhere people can find you on social media.
Yeah, on Twitter, I'm Austin Berg, A_R_Berg. That was made when underscores were like a cool thing to have on Twitter, clearly.
Yeah.
Illinois Policy Institute. So if you go to illinoispolicy.org, most of my stuff is there and stuff of my colleagues.
Great. Well, thank you both for joining. It was a wonderful discussion. And like they said, to learn more, please go buy their book and support this kind of difference in thought and exploration onto municipal issues. So thank you both for joining us today, and let us know at Ballotpedia on Twitter or facebook.com/Ballotpedia if you have any further questions on this topic. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Kara.